Hi, I'm Anne. Welcome back to my channel. And today we are going to be wrapping up the books I read in the first week of the readathon I'm hosting around the world in 80 days. And we are all about England this week. So for those who have missed the beginning of this readathon, this is a readathon where we are trying to read books from all the countries that Phineas Fogg traveled to in Around the World in 80 Days by Jules Verne. It's a great classic. I highly recommend it. I am saving reading the actual book until a little bit later in the readathon, especially when I run out of books from a lot of countries, because this week I ended up reading 4 books set in England. I had 2 on my TBR and I completed those 2, and then I read 2 more, though the 4th one may not technically count for being set in England, but I'll get to that in a minute. So I thought it would be fun with this readathon to just once a week catch you up on how my reading is going and how in the readathon I am doing all the books I am reading, like a mini wrap up, whether that is like just a single book that I read from that month, so it's more of like a book review, a dedicated book review, or like this one where it's like a mini wrap up because I read quite a few books. And I have been reading, let me just say, vivaciously this month. I am impressed. I have probably finished about 15 books at this point, and we are only on, the 18th of January? So yeah, I've been reading almost a book a day. And some of that was because like I had a few days where I just read for hours in the day and finished like a couple books. Some of them was because I started to listen to audiobooks at work, so that really increases how many books I've been able to work through. But also just because I've been trying to prioritize reading more, and also a lot of the stuff, the busyness that I had over the holidays is gone, so I have more time to devote to reading if I want to. So, that out of the way, why don't we get into the books that I read that are set in England? I had a very wide array of very random books. You know, there's some fiction, there's some nonfiction, there's some, like, I guess all of these are like classics or older books. But yeah, they're all from like different eras in history, which is very funny. So even though I started Ivanhoe first by Walter Scott, which was on my TBR for England, I actually ended up reading and finishing Curtain by Agatha Christie first. This is the last book of the Hercule Poirot series by Agatha Christie. I will have a short spoiler section in this video. I won't give like all the spoilers, but I did want to rant a little bit about this book. So Hercule Poirot is someone who's very near and dear to my heart. I discovered Agatha Christie and Hercule Poirot when I was a teenager, and it was one of the detectives that really got me into reading mysteries. And so I have a deep love for Hercule Poirot. But this ending did him totally dirty. Now, so the book is set up is Hastings is much older. He is like the second to Hercule Poirot, often in most of the mystery series. Hercule Poirot is this very exact Belgian gentleman, but he is very old. So this takes place maybe like 30, 40 years after like The Mysterious Affair of Styles, which was the first book that Agatha Christie published in the Hercule Poirot series. And I think that one was published in like 1970. And even though this one I think came out in the 1960s or 1970s, I believe Agatha Christie wrote it back in like the 40s or 50s. So even though she continued on in the Hercule Poirot series, this was written before a lot of the later Hercule Poirot books, and I don't know exactly the timeline. But so Hastings, who was featured in a lot of Hercule Poirot's early mysteries, but not so much his later mysteries, he is called by Poirot to stay at this Styles house, which was an estate in the first book. However, now, 30 some years later, it is a bed and breakfast, and there are mysterious deaths, and Hercule Poirot recruits Hastings to help him with this case. I will stay vague until I get to the spoilers, just because there's a lot of spoilers. And so you have Hastings trying to solve the case as Hercule Poirot is his health very much deteriorating, even though his little gray brain cells are still working very well. So, Let me just briefly mention spoilers. So I will have timestamps down in the, I was about to say description, but technically you can see it in the video itself. I won't get into the spoilers of like the mystery itself, like who did it, but in the end, the murderer is revealed, not by Hastings, but by Hercule Poirot in a letter to Hastings after Poirot has died. And Poirot writes that he realized that he could never prove this murderer was the murderer. So Poirot decided to murder the murderer and then put his pills for his heart far away from the bed, so he knew he would suffer a heart attack, not be able to take the pills that would help him survive, and die. So it is basically a suicide, kind of, in a sense. And I really hated that twist at the end. Everything else in this book was amazing. I think I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I love the mystery. I love Hastings being back, but seeing like Poirot in not the best health, but still being like vivacious and interesting. But the ending just did not, for me, suit Poirot. Poirot is someone who is very filled with like justice. He wants goodness to triumph. And for goodness to then commit an evil in order to stop another evil, it doesn't fit for Poirot. And especially him, in a sense, committing suicide after that. I was a bit livid reading this book. And of course I was sobbing because, Poirot was dying. But I don't think it was the best ending to Agatha Christie. That is a very controversial opinion. Oof, I'm going to get like so much hate in the comments, I'm sure. But yeah, I think Poirot could have had such a better ending. And the entire book, besides that, was a great book and a great conclusion to Poirot's story. But that was just a little bit disappointing. All right, but getting out of spoilers, let's get to the second book I finished, which was Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. So this is technically part of a series, and Walter Scott wrote in the early 1800s, so he was almost contemporary to Jane Austen, and he wrote romance novels, as in high romance, as in adventure, not like modern romance, even though there is some literal romance in here. And he wrote about different eras in history. This one happens to feature Robin Hood. It's set during the rule of Richard the Lionheart. It is where we hear a lot of like the romanticization of Robin Hood and Richard the Lionheart, and Prince John is of course the villain. And so it's not historical. There's very little in this book that is historical. But Ivanhoe, Wilfred of Ivanhoe. Wilfred of Ivanhoe is the son of this, I think he's a Saxon. And during that time, this was about 100 years after the Norman conquest into England. So William the Conqueror came into England in 1066 and took it over. Now, the Saxon people, who had been the ruling class and the majority of the population, there were some Celts around the edges, but the majority of the population, they kind of had to assimilate into the Normans, and there was a lot of conflict because of that. So that is one of the big issues that is commented on in this book. So Ivanhoe, for example, is a Saxon, but a lot of the villains are Normans, but then Richard the Lionheart is also a Norman. So you have a lot of like intermingling and conflict, and the whole theme of that seems to be Walter Scott is saying, let's just get along, learn to get along, even if we have differences, we have more similarities than differences, which I completely agree with. But then you have also a unique commentary on anti-Judaism sentiment in England during that time, and even during the time of Walter Scott, where the Jews were looked down on as money laundering and grubby and below the height of Christianity, especially in the Middle Ages. There was a very anti-Jewish sentiment, which you see later on in history, obviously World War II, Nazi Germany with Hitler. So yeah, the sentiment continued throughout the ages. But that it was another interesting commentary that Scott talked about in this book. But moreover, it's just like a fun nightly adventure. Very much, I will say, the Ivanhoe is not as much the protagonist as I was expecting. He's only featured in a few scenes and parts throughout the book, he's very bland. He's just like this great hero. That's all he is. Like, at least like with Richard the Lionheart, who is also a main character, him at least, he has some interesting characteristics to him. He's rash, but he's also like very morally upright, but he's also a little bit foolish at points, but he's also a good fighter. So you have a lot more depth in his character. Similarly, Robin Hood, Robin of Locksley was also a very interesting character. So I found Ivanhoe to be the least interesting character in this entire book. And also, I think, slight spoilers, but not that much spoilers, I think he should have ended up with Rebecca. He is in love in the beginning with the ward of his father named Rowena, and she is this, I think she's Norman. She might be Norman. She's this beautiful young lady. And then Rebecca, who is this daughter who is Jewish and the daughter of this guy that Ivanhoe ends up rescuing her, and she falls in love with him. She had so much more character than Rowena. Rowena is just like vaguely there in the background, like in love with Ivanhoe. That is her only characteristic. Whereas with Rebecca, she's a very upstanding person. Like she is kidnapped, almost burned as a witch. She is like, she goes through the gambit of just a difficult life. And so I wanted her to have a happy ending, but no, Ivanhoe ends up going back and marrying Rowena. And I understand, like, logically, it wouldn't make sense for Ivanhoe as a Christian to marry a Jewish woman, especially since she had refused earlier. Rebecca had refused to give up her Jewish faith. So it made sense that he didn't marry her because it would be a lot harder during that era to have a married couple of different faiths. But still, I liked Rebecca more, okay? But this was a great adventure. I think I also gave it 4 out of 5 stars. But I would highly recommend it, and I do want to read more Walter Scott books because, yeah, there's just something so, like, light and fun to his books and adventures. So, of course, then I went from that to reading the third book set in England, and this was the other book that was on my physical TBR that I did not think I would finish, but I'm surprised that I did, and that's The History of England by W.E. Lunt. This is like over 900 pages, 950 pages almost. It is a very dry history of England from the beginning of time, and it goes more towards the end of World War II. It was published in 1947, I think. So it goes up right towards the end. It mostly focuses on World War I, but it does have a little bit of World War II, which makes sense. But this book was definitely a whopper to read, and it focuses mostly on the Middle Ages. Now, obviously, because it's tackling such a big amount of history, it's not just tackling the Middle Ages. It's not just tackling like World War II. It's tackling the entire history of England from, the beginning, pre-Celts, prehistoric, all the way to like modern times. It does very much condense the information that it gives. So it's not like detailed in talking about any topic. It focuses a lot on the politics. I would have enjoyed if it had focused more on certain social changes. For example, religion. It doesn't really cover a lot of like the religious transformations in England, especially after the separation from the church by Henry VIII. So it doesn't talk about as much of social changes. It also didn't talk about a lot of like the important things, big stuff that affected England. For example, there was the fire of 1666. There was the Black Plague in, I think, the 1300s. So there was a lot of things that maybe they were briefly mentioned, maybe not even mentioned, but they weren't focused on as much as I thought they would. But I also know that, you have to make sacrifices in what topics you can cover in a history book that covers such a wide range of time and, still stick with the main stuff. So I realized, certain things that he thought was important to include, maybe I didn't think as important, but that's just how it goes. So it was a very good book. I think I also gave it 4 out of 5 stars. It's still a good history book, especially if you are really interested in the history of England and you want like a good overview that that isn't just like a brief like Wikipedia article, that it goes into some of the main details and the main political stuff that was going on that shifted times. This is a good book to read. And the last book that I actually just finished yesterday, which was like the last technical day of the readathon, set in England, and that was, and I'm not sure if this counts because technically it was set in like this fictionalized fake world. That's Utopia by Sir Thomas More, but it is considered one of the greatest English classics of all time. So I'm going to count it, even though technically it's set in like this weird land. So basically it follows this narrator who could be Thomas More himself, and he meets this other person who claims to have visited this world called Utopia, this like perfect place that all civilization should be based off of. And so the entire book is them having a conversation as this man witnesses exactly what this society is like. A lot of people take this book seriously. This was written very much as a satire, and you see that in like certain small places. Like there's certain ways that obviously this world that is discussed is not a utopia. For example, they still have slaves. Women can't choose who they marry. It's also kind of creepy that like one of the things that socially they do in that society is if you marry, if you aren't married and you have like relations with somebody, you know, do the dirty, you will not be allowed to get married ever unless you're proved to be like, you get a dispensation from the prince. You also can't travel without the prince's approval. This like prince, one thing that pushed it over into nonsense for me was that in the society you are not allowed to feel pain. It's all about pleasure. Which is something that is very anti to Christianity, of which Thomas More was very Catholic. You know, he was executed because he refused to agree with Henry VIII breaking away from the Pope and the Vatican and, you know, Catholicism. It doesn't make sense for him to include that, especially since the whole point of Christianity is that you become better, you grow in virtues because of the pain you endure. And I've noticed that in my own life is when you suffer hardship, you end up being in a sense, better person. And I'm not saying, you know, those who haven't gone through hardship can't be good people. It's just that you have more gratitude, you have more kindness because you realize how harsh the world can be. So I think pain, if you deal with it correctly, can be good. So a lot of this book is nonsense. It's making fun of this utopian society that was being idealized during his lifetime. A lot of the ideas, and it's oddly enough, the society contained in the utopian world is actually very similar to the modern socialism. Not entirely, but where everything is owned collectively. One thing that like creeps me out is it's mentioned that like in this society, like no one can close their doors, or you can just enter anyone's house whenever you want to, which I'm like, I need a little bit of privacy, you know, stop that. Everything is collectively owned. And so it was interesting how like, obviously socialism wasn't invented when More lived, but this was almost like a precursor to socialism. So it's interesting how like these ideologies and philosophies have been talked about way before, you know, maybe the firm invention of this sort of thing, where there were a lot of ideas going on. So I ended up giving this 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it. It was so much fun, even though I would not want to live in the utopian world contained in this book. But so those were all the books that I read that were set in England. I've talked a lot about them at this point. I feel like I've blabbered on, but I'm curious, have you read any of these books? If you are participating in the Round the World for 80 Days Readathon, what books did you read for England this week? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, like, subscribe, and I will see you all in the next one. Bye!